It starts with a single arrest. Not some big takedown on Wall Street, but a local bust. One guy, one condemned property.
Right. And from that one sort of messy local event.
Everything unravels.
Yeah.
And it rips the cover off what federal agents are now. I mean, they're openly calling it the largest domestic fraud enterprise in American history.
It's an incredible story.
Right.
And the investigation, it didn't begin in some high-tech financial crimes unit. It started in the back alleys of Maine.
In a drug house.
Exactly. You have federal agents going into this condemned building, seizing meth, fentanyl, firearms, and they walk out with a city councilman, the Somali politician named Ayman Osman, arrested on felony gun charges.
And that single arrest, which on its face just looks like a crazy local crime story.
It becomes the trigger. The one thread that, when pulled, detonates a nationwide investigation into billions of stolen taxpayer dollars.
The shockwave was just immediate, because you realize this isn't just, some low-level street crime. This one politician's arrest uncovered this coordinated multi-billion-dollar network.
Oh, absolutely. It connected everything. Sophisticated welfare schemes, massive COVID aid fraud rings, and deeply entrenched political corruption that stretched across state lines.
Even across continents.
And we have to start with the sheer magnitude of it all, the betrayal. This money was meant for emergency pandemic programs.
For the most vulnerable people.
How about
during a global crisis?
And federal prosecutors are now on record saying this may be the single biggest welfare fraud in the history of the United States. We're not talking millions. The sources point to a conservative estimate of billions of dollars.
Billions. Siphoned out with organized, almost corporate precision. That kind of number. It doesn't just change the headlines.
No?
It changes the public's trust in government aid. It changes policy overnight. Stay with us as we expose the full truth behind this whole scandal. If you want the news they don't want you to hear, hit that subscribe button right now. Okay, let's really unpack that beginning because it is the crucial pivot point. This whole thing, this massive nationwide manhunt, it all hinged on one incredibly messy arrest.
Ayman Osman, the Somali city councilman in Maine.
Right. Felony gun theft charges. So why did this local scandal, tied to a drug house with fentanyl and guns, why did that instantly get the attention of, Washington?
Right.
Of federal fraud task forces hundreds of miles away?
That's the critical question, the why. I mean, the arrest itself was stunning, right? A local official, felony gun charge connected to a major drug operation.
That's already a huge story.
It is, but it was the context, the location, and the timing. That's what provided the missing link for investigators.
Yeah.
This condemned property Osman was tied to, it wasn't just some minor issue. Federal agents had seized a truly massive haul of narcotics there.
We're talking hard drugs.
Methamphetamines, fentanyl, cocaine, and multiple firearms. So right away, this is elevated from some local political scandal to a serious federal criminal investigation.
And then the cover-up attempt that followed was almost immediate, which just drew more suspicion.
Oh, instantly. He and his lawyer, they tried to spin this whole story to justify why he was even there.
What was the story they tried to sell?
Well, when reporters started asking the tough questions, what were you doing there? What about the felony gun charges? His lawyer came out and claimed the councilman had been getting serious death threats.
Ah, so he was there for his own safety. That's the angle.
That was the angle. That he was staying in this, unusual or isolated location for security reasons.
Wait, hold on. A politician is claiming death threats to justify living at a condemned drug house. Did the police confirm any of that?
They did the exact opposite.
No way.
Investigators checked the records immediately, and the police department confirmed in writing that no such reports of death threats had ever been filed. They didn't exist.
So the story just completely crumbled.
Instantly. Under the most basic scrutiny. So now you don't just have a dirty local politician. You have a political figure tied to serious narcotics and firearms who is now actively engaging in what looks like a federal obstruction or cover-up attempt.
So the perfect storm. Drugs, guns, a politician, and a really obvious lie. But I still want to know, why did this one incident in Maine make alarm bells go off for agencies focused on, welfare fraud in Minnesota?
The timing. It was all about the timing and the pattern recognition that came right after.
Okay.
The sources are very clear on this. Osman's arrest happened in the exact same week that federal agencies, we're talking DHS, IRS Criminal Investigation, the DOJ, were getting ready to drop massive new fraud indictments.
And those indictments were tied to?
Somali-run networks, mostly centered in Minneapolis and St. Paul, Minnesota.
So it wasn't a coincidence. It was a collision.
It was a direct data collision. You see, for years, federal agencies have had this silo effect. They had hundreds of active cases they were all treating as separate, isolated incidents.
It's like wire fraud in one city, money laundering in another.
Exactly. Wire fraud in Minneapolis, complex money laundering operations flagged in Maine, suspicious nonprofit transfers tied to COVID aid in Ohio, individual asylum schemes out on the West Coast.
And they saw them as separate because they were in different places targeting different programs.
Precisely. But the Osmond arrest, it forced the analysts to look across all those different databases for overlap. They asked a really simple but devastating question.
Which was?
Does this politician who is connected to hard crime, does he also have connections to any of the complex financial fraud cases we're already looking at?
And the answer they found was that statistical impossibility you mentioned.
Absolutely. When they cross-reference the names, the addresses, the organizations tied to Osmond with the fraud networks in Minnesota, the data overlap was, mathematically stunning.
What did they find? What kind of overlap?
They found the exact same family surnames appearing again and again in totally different fraud cases. They found the same shell corporations. They found these so-called community organizations that had identical legal structures, suspiciously similar banking routes, and were operating in Maine, Minnesota, and Washington State all at the same time.
So they weren't dealing with separate crimes anymore. They were looking at one unified system.
Precisely. The analysts synthesizing this data, they described the overlap as statistically impossible to be accidental. Imagine, flipping a coin 100 times and it lands on heads 98 times.
Something's wrong.
That's the level of unlikeliness they were seeing. It wasn't random crime. It was a single, coordinated, nationwide system that was hiding in plain sight.
How does that level of coordination, spanning state lines, targeting different federal programs, how does that hide for so long?
The sources point to two big factors. First, just the sheer volume of emergency pandemic money that was flooding the system. It just overwhelmed any kind of real oversight.
Okay, that makes sense.
And second, the way the network used these deep-seated community structures to operate under the radar. The complexity it takes to run schemes this sophisticated suggests real organizational power. One DHS official summed it up perfectly. He said the Osmond arrest was the key that unlocked the entire structure.
So before this, they were just chasing individual fires.
Chasing individual flames, exactly. After this arrest, they realized they were fighting a conflagration that spanned the continent. And they finally had the blueprint, starting with one city councilman in Maine.
And the implication is so clear. The arrest didn't just expose a local politician. It exposed a massive operational security failure of a deeply entrenched criminal enterprise.
And once they had that blueprint, it led them straight to the financial epicenter, Minnesota.
Which brings us right to Section 2, where the scale of this financial devastation really, really hits home. When this story first broke, everyone was focused on the Feeding Our Future scandal in Minnesota, FOF.
And for good reason. The FOF scandal by itself was just a shocking example of theft. We're talking over $250 million.
$250 million.
And this was money specifically earmarked for federally funded programs to feed hungry children who were out of school during the pandemic.
It
vanished. The source material details exactly where it went. Straight into luxury cars, massive overseas money transfers, and funneled through this just dizzying array of fraudulent shell nonprofits that were set up for one reason.
To get the grant money.
To get the grant money.
Stealing from the most vulnerable kids during a crisis. That number, $250 million, was already enraging. But let me just interrupt you here, because this is the critical revelation from this deep dive. That $250 million, that was just the surface layer.
That is the terrifying reality. Federal auditors and law enforcement, they realized the FOF scandal was just the tip of a colossal multi-layered iceberg. Once that Osmond connection gave them the pattern, the key, they saw that FOF was just one successful product line, if you will, within an entire ecosystem of fraud.
An ecosystem.
An ecosystem of interconnected, coordinated schemes. And this whole thing functioned like a giant, sophisticated, multi-billion-dollar money laundering operation, all systematically feeding off every weak point in the federal aid system.
Okay, we need to slow down and explain that. What specific separate frauds were running underneath the FOF umbrella? What were the mechanics of it?
They targeted the broadest possible range of government support systems all at the same time. So first you had housing stabilization fraud.
Okay.
During the pandemic, emergency rental assistance programs surged. So the fraud here involved creating fake or duplicated identities and then filing multiple claims across different state programs for the same non-existent person or property.
They were exploiting the chaos, the rush.
Exactly. They knew cross-state verification was slow or just not happening.
That's clever, but just so cold.
Then you had direct exploitation of vulnerable people. We're talking about the creation of fake autism services. This one is particularly egregious.
Fake autism services. How does that even work?
These networks would set up phony therapy centers or clinics. Then they'd bill Medicaid or specialized state programs for services that were either never delivered at all or were wildly inflated.
For instance,
They'd bill for, say, 24-hour intensive care for a child based on totally fabricated documents, when in reality that child might have gotten minimal therapy or none at all. They would bill for specialized staff and expensive treatments that just didn't exist.
wow. That's targeting complex healthcare funding streams.
Yeah.
That's not simple. That takes planning.
It absolutely does. This wasn't a smash and grab job. It required real familiarity with complex medical billing codes, with state payment systems. And on top of that, they ran massive schemes with inflated daycare billing.
How so?
Charging hugely inflated rates, maybe 5 or 6 times the market price. Or, just as often, billing for kids who just did not exist. Or were not attending the daycare. And finally, they just fabricated food distribution reports, mimicking the FOF structure on a smaller scale over and over again.
This reads like a blueprint for an organized crime syndicate, not just a series of mistakes.
It was absolutely structured. Federal auditors now believe this entire interconnected ecosystem laundered billions of dollars. The source material explicitly says this wasn't just opportunistic crime. It calls the fraud structured, strategic, and years in the making.
So if we're talking billions, how do you disappear that much money? I mean, wouldn't traditional banks flag that? How do they launder it?
And this is where the structural element of the network is so important. They used what the sources identify as clan-based informal economies, specifically a system called Hawala.
Hawala. Can you explain that? For anyone listening who hasn't heard that term, why is that system the perfect tool for this kind of crime?
Certainly. Hawala is a very old trust-based system for moving money. You see it a lot in the Middle East, Africa, and South Asia. And it relies on a network of brokers, or hawaladars.
And it's all based on trust, not like wire transfers.
Exactly. It's based on kinship, loyalty, and trust, rather than physical cash moving or electronic bank transfers.
So there's no paper trail.
Virtually none of the traditional paper trail that Western law enforcement relies on. I mean, a wire transfer goes through the SWIFT system, right? It leaves an electronic footprint. It requires know your customer checks.
Right.
A Hawala transaction is different. You give cash to a broker in, say, Minneapolis. That broker just calls or texts his counterpart broker in Somalia or Dubai and says, pay X amount to Mr. Y. The money is instantly available overseas.
Based on just a phone call.
Based purely on trust. The accounts get settled up later, so the value is transferred immediately, completely bypassing federal banking oversight, anti-money laundering rules, and international surveillance. It was the ideal system for this.
And that structural advantage, that leads us to the most chilling part of this whole investigation. The fact that this wasn't just about people getting rich.
No. It was a clear national security issue. Intelligence briefings found that the financial trail didn't just stop at luxury cars and nice houses for the people involved. Crucially, they found evidence that money was moving overseas toward extremist-linked groups.
Extremist-linked groups. So you're saying federal aid, stolen from American programs, was potentially funding international terror operations.
That is the direct implication drawn by Homeland Security. And that immediately elevated this whole thing from a complex fraud case to a matter for counterterrorism units.
So it's not just tax fraud anymore.
It's a clear and present threat to national security. And that's what justified the complete massive shift in the federal approach and the urgency of the manhunt that followed.
And given the scale, the financial expertise you're talking about, it makes perfect sense why the investigation focused so heavily on the Twin Cities.
Absolutely. The DHS analysis concluded that the Minneapolis-St. Paul fraud network was the financial engine behind multiple national schemes. It wasn't just a local hub. It was the centralized operational and financial
The
base.
headquarters.
It's where the most sophisticated players were, where they processed the largest volumes of money, and where they orchestrated the whole multi-state operation. Once that engine was exposed by the Osman arrest, the national manhunt was inevitable.
And when you lay out all that information, the billions stolen, the organized networks, the money flowing to extremist groups, it provides the context for why President Trump's response was so immediate and so powerful.
The intelligence reports landed right on the president's desk, and that is when the political temperature went critical.
The executive response was, it was swift and it was incredibly politically charged.
President Trump ordered a nationwide sweep, a multi-agency surge targeting every single suspected COVID aid fraud ring that was tied to these networks. It was a clear signal that the administration saw this not as a local problem, but as a critical failure of national security.
What was the scope of this manhunt? That phrase itself, largest domestic fraud manhunt, is a massive claim. Does the source material back that up?
It does, mainly through the sheer coordination and resources that were committed. Trump authorized these multi-state task forces that pulled people from DHS intelligence, IRS criminal investigators, and a huge number of DOJ prosecutors.
So they were combining forces.
Right. They unified these agencies that often work in separate silos. One senior federal attorney described it as using unprecedented resources focused purely on this type of organized domestic financial crime. That's what justifies the description as the largest domestic fraud manhunt in U.S. history.
And the most stunning policy decision that came out of this, the one that made international news, was the termination of temporary protected status, or TPS, for Somali nationals.
That was a major policy reversal. TPS is designed to shield migrants from deportation if their home country is facing some kind of temporary crisis, like a war or a natural disaster.
And it had been expanded before this.
It had. It gave thousands of Somali nationals a measure of security. But the Trump administration's termination of this status was directly linked to what they were finding in the fraud probe.
What was the official law enforcement rationale for pulling that protection? They had to know it would be politically explosive.
They did. Federal investigators detailed widespread exploitation of TPS within the criminal networks. They were finding individuals who had allegedly gotten TPS based on claims of vulnerability or asylum, but who were at the same time using that protected status to commit massive domestic fraud.
How were they exploiting it?
They found duplicated identities being used to file multiple claims. They found individuals funneling huge amounts of stolen federal aid money abroad using the Hawala system, all while being shielded from deportation by their protected status.
So the government's argument was that TPS was being actively weaponized by criminals against the very system that was protecting them.
Precisely. Law enforcement argued they couldn't effectively dismantle these crime rings when key suspects and witnesses were using TPS as a legal shield against investigation and deportation. So the termination was seen as a necessary, if politically devastating, step.
And the consequence for the broader community, not just the criminals.
The shift was immediate and drastic. Thousands of Somali nationals who relied on TPS, regardless of whether they were involved or not, they suddenly faced new scrutiny. New background checks, potential interviews, and in some cases, immediate deportation proceedings. The legal ground just shifted out from under them.
And as you'd expect, the public outcry was immediate.
Oh, within hours. Mass protests erupted across the country. Minneapolis, Seattle, Columbus. Crowds were blocking major intersections, federal buildings.
And the narrative from the activists was what?
They immediately framed it politically. They argued that Trump was criminalizing immigrants, that he was using the fraud investigation as a pretext for xenophobic enforcement.
So they just ignored the billions of stolen dollars and the evidence of the organized crime network.
That's the core of the political collision. While federal prosecutors had mountains of evidence detailing the largest welfare fraud in U.S. history, the dominant public narrative, which was driven by activists and certain media outlets, focused only on the perceived cruelty of the TPS reversal.
But that narrative, the idea that immigrants were being unfairly targeted, it was severely undercut by the corruption receipts that came out.
This was, politically, maybe the most damaging part of the whole thing. Federal filings exposed that multiple prominent Minnesota Democratic lawmakers had accepted tens of thousands of dollars in campaign donations from key figures who were now formally charged in the Feeding Our Future fraud ring.
This wasn't just a few bucks here and there.
No, these were significant sums coming directly from individuals identified as central operational figures in this alleged multi-billion-dollar scheme. The optics were just disastrous.
At the same time, they're draining federal programs, they're donating to the campaigns of the very politicians who are supposed to be providing oversight.
That's right. The connection was undeniable. It was sitting right there in the public campaign finance reports.
And when they were confronted, what was the excuse? How did they try to explain it?
A flurry of standard political defenses. It was a community outreach effort, or we didn't know the money was criminal at the time. Many of them rushed to claim they had returned the donations once the charges went public.
But the damage was done.
Voters and investigators largely dismissed it. It made it look like the corruption wasn't even hidden. It was just openly recorded in campaign finance reports.
And the legacy media's response to this seemed like they went into full damage control.
They did. Corporate media outlets immediately rolled out panels and commentary pieces questioning the motives of the federal prosecutors. They suggested Trump was unfairly weaponizing immigration enforcement.
So they focused on the raids being controversial or the TPS termination being cruel. What facts did that coverage tend to leave out?
They strategically minimized or just omitted the hard evidence, the billions of dollars that were gone, the detailed reports showing the money flowed to organized crime networks, the reality of the children who never got the food. They painted the communities as purely victims and the administration as the aggressor.
So it became a clash of narratives. Identity politics versus documented financial crime.
And when leaders like Ilhan Omar finally addressed the scandal, they chose to deflect by blaming the government.
How so?
She went on record insisting the fraud was caused by program design flaws. She claimed the agencies rushed the aid out during the pandemic and didn't build in enough guardrails. It's a classic political deflection.
Blame the system, not the criminals.
Exactly. But what that defense completely failed to acknowledge was the sheer criminality of it all. The evidence was overwhelming. People were fabricating entire lists of children who didn't exist, forging thousands of signatures, routing money through illegal international systems.
That's not a design flaw, that's organized crime.
That is systematic, intentional deceit. Her defense strategically omitted any mention of the stolen billions, the highly organized network, or the documented cultural patterns like clan loyalties that investigators said were exploited by these criminal groups.
So the political clash was just unmistakable. Deflection versus mountains of evidence. And the public was left to weigh the outrage against the need for accountability. After all the political maneuvering, the government responded with enforcement that really signaled the official start of this domestic fraud manhunt. And this wasn't some administrative process.
No, this was a dramatic demonstration of federal force. The sources, they paint a very clear picture. Before sunrise, federal tactical teams flooded into Minneapolis and St. Paul. We're talking armored vehicles, massive deployments of ICE agents, Homeland Security agents.
How many officers?
Over 100, all involved in these coordinated sweeps. They had search warrants, asset forfeiture orders, and final removal orders.
That level of tactical visibility must have just changed the perception of crime in those neighborhoods overnight.
That was precisely the intent. Federal prosecutors were executing warrants against people known to be central to these criminal schemes. Residents were watching as agents raided properties, seized documents, took suspects into custody.
Well, it was a wake-up call.
For many communities, it was the moment they realized the true scale of the organized crime that had been operating right under their noses for years, shielded by political correctness.
And crucially, the investigation didn't just stop in Minnesota. The crackdown went nationwide.
That's the vital part of the manhunt. As the analysts followed the money trails uncovered by the Osmond arrest, they realized the same financial fingerprints were popping up all over the country.
Or else?
In Ohio, Washington, back in Maine, Colorado, Texas. This confirmed that the whole thing was centralized and nationwide.
What were those exact fingerprints? What were the commonalities that proved it was all being managed from one place?
It came down to structural and operational identicality. First, they found shell corporations and nonprofits in 5 different states that had identical legal structures.
The same paperwork?
The same language in the articles of incorporation, the same suspicious nonprofit status, often the same registered legal reps. It proved they were being centrally organized.
Like a franchise model for fraud.
Exactly what it was. Second, the overseas money transfers, no matter where they started, Maine or Minnesota, they were consistently routed through the same small cluster of intermediaries, often using the same hawala brokers.
Which suggests a central money laundering service for the whole network.
It strongly suggested it. And third, they found grant applications across multiple states that used duplicate lists of beneficiaries and recycled, I mean verbatim, application language for totally different aid programs.
That level of administrative laziness, just copying and pasting, that's what became the forensic evidence.
It was undeniable proof of central control. DHS analysts concluded that what America had assumed were just isolated incidents of COVID aid abuse were actually interconnected fraud wings moving billions of dollars with incredible precision and speed.
And their final assessment.
Based on all this evidence, their assessment was that these networks collectively represent the largest welfare fraud enterprise in U.S. history. It dwarfed anything seen before.
That realization must have just fundamentally shifted the government's entire posture.
It did. For years, the source material notes political correctness had buried these concerns. Leaders were terrified of being labeled xenophobic if they scrutinized certain communities or aid recipients too closely.
But this changed that.
December 2025, the date of this huge sweep, effectively shattered that spell. When you have incontrovertible evidence of billions missing, extremist links, and political corruption, the public's tolerance for sacrificing truth for optics just evaporates.
And President Trump's message, enough is enough, it resonated because it addressed that core issue of impunity.
This whole moment became bigger than just partisanship. It was about confronting a criminal system that exploited taxpayer generosity, that manipulated identity politics to create a shield, and that operated with absolute impunity.
The government was finally asserting that restoring integrity was paramount.
And that massive theft would be met with maximum federal force, no matter what the political fallout was.
I think the ultimate takeaway here is that America's eyes are wide open now, and the standards for both criminal and political accountability have permanently shifted.
If we look at the long-term projection, the core lesson is absolutely about restoring integrity to these aid programs. The question is no longer if billions can be stolen from them. We have absolute proof that they can be.
So the question now is what?
The question now is whether the government can build guardrails strong enough to prevent the exploitation of identity politics and systemic fear from enabling the next wave of massive fraud. Because if these loopholes aren't permanently closed, these networks won't disappear.
They'll just adapt.
They will simply adapt their franchise model to the next crisis program, whether that's climate aid, housing assistance, or the next global emergency fund. That adaptation and that continued threat is the chilling reality we have to confront.
That's the reality we're facing. But I want to know what you think. After hearing about the scale of this fraud and seeing that the alleged fraudsters donated tens of thousands of dollars to local political campaigns, should politicians who took those donations be forced to step down even if they claim they returned the money? Should accountability extend to the campaign cash trail? Let us know your opinion in the comments below. We read every single one. I'm host speaker.
And I'm expert speaker. Thanks for listening to this deep dive.